And again, welcome to our 12th annual Parent Empowerment Conference. I'd like to thank a couple of our co-sponsors, Parents Place of Maryland, Pathfinders of Autism for Autism, CCAC PG, Spectrum of Hope. I believe Dr. Abila Tizano is on with us this morning, guiding exceptional parents, and particularly our Office of Language Access and Engagement, which is providing interpretation across all of our sessions. This morning, we are super excited to welcome Paula Moraine. She has been a teacher and tutor for elementary grades, high school, and college students, as well as a mentor, coach, and adult educator in the US, Germany, and Scotland. She's lectured widely in the US and abroad on themes of dyslexia, ADHD, executive function, autism, parenting, and teaching. She is the author of Helping Students Take Control of Everyday Executive Functioning, The Attention Fix, and Autism and Everyday Executive Functions. She is also the past president of the Maryland branch of the International Dyslexia Association and the Eastern Region representative to the branch council of the International Dyslexia Association. So welcome, Ms. Paula. And we are excited to turn it over to you. I do want to say if you have questions, we will be taking questions along the way. Please put them in the chat. There may be some times when we tell you that that question is better covered in ahead slides, and we'll kind of put it on hold for a little bit, but we will also have a little bit of time at the end for questions. So Paula, I'm going to stop sharing and let you take it over.
Thank you. Well, I'm happy to be here with everybody, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. It's lovely. So does everything look okay to you the way that it's set up now? Okay, good. All right. So the title of our talk today is Helping Students Take Control of Everyday Executive Function. And the reason that it's given this name is partly because that was the title of my first book, but what I discovered in all of my work as a tutor, as a teacher, as a coach, as a mentor, as a teacher educator, is that it's the everyday executive function that impacts not only the student in their learning, but it impacts the student in their home life. And I will be bridging that learning environment with the home life throughout the talk this morning, because as parents, that actually is what concerns you the most. This won't be directed primarily at how teachers need to work on executive function in the classroom. But the way that I'm going to approach it is from a big perspective first, and then we'll get into the details. I'm an extremely practical person, so do not be worried with the first few large overview thoughts that we're going to work with, because they will pass soon enough and we'll get right into the practical. What does it really look like? But in order to give you a, oh dear, hold on. How come it's not going? Let's do it this way then. In order to give you a very good idea of what I'm looking at, is that we're going to look at this one word, which is salutogenesis. Don't worry about it. You'll probably never hear it again. But I am going to tell you that this word is very interesting because it comes from the root saluto, which means health, and genesis, which means the origin. So this came about as a word to indicate what is the origin of our health. Where does our health come from? Now, this is in a broad sense of health: physical health, mental health, emotional health, learning health. It's all together. What makes us feel healthy? And let me see, that's still not going to go. Okay, we'll just do it down here. All right, so that study that was done by this man named Aaron Antonvosky, who is an Israeli-American psychologist, he did a lot of studies, fascinating studies. I'm not going to get into any of that today because this is not an academic presentation. But what he did do was come up with a principle that, based on all of his work, he said that this health-giving experience was it culminated as a sense of coherence, but it was made up of the fact that the student, and I'm going to speak about students today, whether they're young or adult, comprehensibility. The question that we could ask is, do our students understand what's happening in their world? Do they understand what's going on and what they're expected to do? The second is manageability. Is the student being asked to do something that is relevant to them? And can they manage it? I'm sorry, manageability, I should have put that last. Manageability really means, can they do it? But the meaningfulness is the relevance. So here we have 3 questions we can ask of our students. Do they understand what's happening to them? Do they find it relevant? And can they do it? Do they have the skills to do it? So very often what you hear is somebody coming up and saying, my student has executive function difficulties because they can't do it. And what I'm going to try to present today is how we can understand these 3 components of comprehensibility, these 3 integrating experiences, in such a way that we know where we can help our given student. Some of you are going to be parents of young children. Some of you might be parents of older children. Some of you might even be the adult that is wanting to understand this better. The very first thing that I can say is that when we talk about executive function, I'd like to just be sure that everybody is on the same page about this. The executive function is a set of brain functions that take place in this prefrontal cortex of our brain and controls essentially our attention and our behavior. Bottom line, that's kind of what it does. It's the slowest maturing function of our brain. We learn to hear, see, process language, move, all these other brain functions, our math functions, all of these mature much faster. We're talking by the time we're, a year and a half. We're walking by the time we're a year, roughly speaking. And the executive function, the decision-making, the planning, the organization, all the relationship to time, all of these processes, how we manage our attention, are only going to come to maturity around the age of 30. Now, some of you might have young children in kindergarten, first, second, third grade. So you with the 8-year-old or 10-year-old, you're only a third of the way there. Our teenagers are only halfway there. I think it's important to realize what we're talking about is a set of activities that arc over the first 30 years of your life. And it's not a fast process, no matter what you do. It is a really slow and steady process. So if we can remember that, then everything else that I'm going to say today will make much more sense. So with that in mind, I also want to just bring up this other piece of information that I think is really important for parents, especially, to understand. Because I have a private practice, at least up to COVID, I had it in person. But the biggest question that parents had was, I'm told that my child has difficulty with executive function. What can I do? And oftentimes, one of the biggest first things that a parent can do is understand what activity belongs in what area. So let's take a look at this one slide that I just put tutoring and coaching up here, because I think this will help you understand the differences of where our students can reach out for help. So on the tutoring side, you have all of those activities that relate to the academic setting. So I would include the classroom on that side, because in the classroom, the goal of the teacher is to engage with a process of learning the academics that is subject specific or content specific, you could say. And it's related to building skills in that area, how you learn to read, write, do math, the skills of education, and also those transferable skills. So how do you learn to, make a project become 3D, or build something, or socially engage, or all of the things that are the other activities of the everyday school life. And this is also the area where the teaching and learning environment needs to have a very specific amount of repeat, review, and refresh, because most learning doesn't happen on one flyby. And that's because of the way our executive functions work. So it's, as we get talking about the specifics of the executive functions throughout the morning, I think that will be understood as one of the most important pieces that in the academic setting, whether it's tutoring or classrooms, that the student really needs those activities of repeat, review, and refresh. Now, let's take a look at the coaching side. What would a coach do for the student with executive function challenges? Well, the coach would understand how that student approaches learning, and that is going to be brain-based. This is not an attitude issue. To start with, the learning approach is based on how that student's brain is literally wired. So if they're learning and they are a very visual or a very auditory or a very kinesthetic person, that's one way to understand it. Another way to understand it is, how does the learning style manifest based on what the student's processing skills are? How do they process information? What is their memory like? These are all things that influence learning styles. The coach will also work with attitude, and attitude, please understand, is usually not something the student is born with. Attitude usually comes about through the experiences the student has had, whether they're positive, negative, challenging, difficult, how much they have experienced pushback in their environment. Attitude is usually something that is the result of ununderstood experiences, demands that haven't been able to be met, etc. And attitude will manifest differently at different ages. The relationships the student has is going to be something that you approach very clearly if you're in a coaching environment, because too many times people overlook how a relationship situation has either influenced in a positive way or hindered that student from engaging effectively with whatever they're learning. Context matters. Is the student being asked to learn in an environment and context that is conducive for that student? Or is there something about the context that needs to be understood? And this is where the coach might be able to notice the difference of the effect of a relationship at school between even peers and or instructors, adults, or relationships at home, because they will both affect how the student engages in learning. Self-awareness, that's something that a coach might be more able to work with, because it is a tender thing to engage with a student, to ask them to be self-aware. And what I often do is, if a parent has come into my office and maybe it appears on the paperwork from school that the student needs to self-advocate, and that's really what the problem is. And I say to the parents, let's sort of look at that one again, because what does self-advocating mean? It means that you're asking the student to have self-knowledge. Let's start with you. How much self-knowledge do you think you have? As an adult, are you full of it? And can you even advocate for yourself? So what happens when you try to go to your workplace and advocate for yourself? Is it successful? Do you do it? And if you don't, then there's a power imbalance there that you're not sure about, and you're not going to advocate in that power imbalance. So I'm really careful with that language, and I don't start with it. I don't recommend that people just say to a student, you need to advocate for yourself. And then it has to be, the coach needs to understand how to make the help executive function specific. Because you can have a student that has one or the other aspect of executive function that's not really working very well, but some others might be working really fine. So you need to be able to be specific. So here we have a really interesting difference between tutoring that shares characteristics with the classroom environment, and coaching, which shares characteristics with a more therapeutic approach, like what you would get from a counselor or a mental health professional even. And what is the space for the parent to occupy? The problem here is that the parent is asked to occupy both, because you're constantly, as parents, working as the go-between between what is the experience of the school life and what is the experience of maybe the more personal, individualized life of that student. And as parents, this can be extremely frustrating, because how are you supposed to know what all of these aspects mean? It's hard. So with that in mind, I wanted to identify some of the issues that the parent actually can experience, and understand maybe a few things about why you have some tools at your disposal. So one, as a parent, one can look at every home life, whether it's intentional or not, will have a rhythm and a set of routines that are just belonging to your family. They aren't maybe belonging to anyone else, and you may or may not have actually intentionally settled those rhythms and routine in place. It doesn't matter. The fact is, it's human nature to set up a kind of a rhythmic set of activities and a kind of a routine set of activities. At home, the student is engaged in modeling and imitating your behaviors. That's also extremely natural, and it's extremely individualized. So whoever you are as a parent, the student will model and imitate that. It's also the job of the parent that they naturally set up habits. Now, some families set up many and clear habits. Other families will set up more sort of unidentified habits, but they're habits nonetheless, because that's what your family does. Every student wants to think of their home life as the most trusted and safe zone in their lives. And this is one of the reasons why I point out to parents that it shouldn't be surprising if your student comes home at the end of a school day and just melts down. because there is no more trusted or safe spot for that student to just let go of all the tension, the anxiety, the worry, the frustration, the misunderstandings, all of the things that they've held on to all day long. And so this is where it's really important to differentiate between what one could call bad behavior, or is this the student just laying down the burden of their stress? Our students are more stressed than we understand. And this is one place where if we can identify at home that their stress levels are safe with us, then they will be able to process it a lot quicker. And if we as parents don't take it personally, then it is going to be safer for the student to be in that home situation. The personal biography of every child is their birthright. So the one thing that we can, if we can get this picture that we have the children who are in their birthright within their family, and they go out from the family into school settings, community settings, friends and neighbor settings, and come back to the family. This is why, as parents, the more we understand what is that we are providing our students in terms of support for executive function, I would say one of the most important things you're doing is teaching your student that being home is safe, that being in their birthright will bring the world right again. So having a lot of resistance to a student who comes home and melts down and says, oh, it was the most terrible day of my entire life, and oh, my teacher was so mean to me, and listen past that to, I'm home, I'm safe, and if I just can regroup, I'll be okay. Now, this is a kind of a general statement, but I just wanted to kind of put that out there because so often we hear what one does for school, what one does for, learning in other environments, but we forget parents are a very, very big part of a child's life. And by remembering this birthright is the zone of safety is really important. Okay. Now, let's talk about executive function, specific and directly. What is it? You might be surprised to know that nowhere is there a one single, consistent, agreed upon definition of executive function. It doesn't appear in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual for Mental Disorders, such as that has the definitions for autism and ADHD and even dyslexia. All of those things are in the DSM-5, but the executive functions aren't. And yet it's your executive function that directly and without any ambiguity affects and controls the functions of your attention and your behavior. So how many times do you hear that so-and-so's attention is wandering, or so-and-so does not pay attention? We're going to talk quite a bit about attention today, because I think that is a very, very misunderstood area of our students' experiences. It's also the place where we control our behavior, where we make decisions to act in this way or act in that way, from something as simple as where do I put my backpack down when I get home, to how do I organize my weekend to be able to get all my work done. It's all belonging to that control of behavior. So with that in mind, let's also take a quick look at child development, because it is imperative when we talk about executive function to understand that there are chunks of time that influence our students. So if we look at the time between birth and 7, this is rough, right? But roughly around the age of 7, the child is really in school, ready for learning. You know, they're definitely in school already, but they're differently ready for learning because that 0 to 7 is their babyhood and early childhood, which should be filled with play and imitation and learning through doing. And everything is, if you were to ask, what does the student experience in those years? Their experience is that they are the center of the universe. And that's normal, that is natural. So over teaching those early years, over scrutinizing their social interactions and or their academic achievements in those early years might take away from some of the other strength building activities, such as play. One of the biggest concerns I have as an educator concerned with executive function is the extraordinary impact of our systems that take play out of the equation in those early years. If our students are not playing enough in those early years, they're not experiencing enough of the executive skill building, learning through doing, practicing, you know, even parallel play in the sandbox is a great executive function foundation layer. Interacting with other children, interacting with ideas, interacting with all of the things that encourage play. So that would be something I would say, let's leave our younger children to play a little bit more. If our goal is executive function development, early play will get them there faster than almost anything else. The school child, roughly, obviously they're in school by 7, there's no question. But those students, if their content is delivered with imagination and movement and an inner sort of a sense of wonder and joy, that those years of executive function development will then be filled with being able to experience and experiment. So in those years as a teacher, one of the things that I always wanted to do was provide options for try it, see what happens, and let me know what you think when you're finished. And as much as possible, I gave my students experiential moments so that I could minimize the type of education that says there is one way to do this, you do it that way, or it's wrong. The black and white, either or, yes, no. In those years of 7 to 14, it's really important to balance it so that the student gets some try it, and if it didn't work, then maybe let's talk about why it didn't work, because then we can fix it. And the student learns through adapting, adjusting, trying again, understanding. They learn through doing. That's, I think, the real meaning of learning through doing. But if the student is always given a final grade, so this was one of the things I learned in Scotland as I was teaching through the University of Aberdeen, and they had it in the teaching department. And one of the things that they always said was, when you give a student assessments, you have a formative assessment and you have a summative assessment. Now that's academic talk for different kinds of assessment. But how they described it was the formative assessment is the same as when the cook tastes the soup. adds a little more salt, a little less of this, a little more of that. That's formative assessment. The summative assessment is when you serve the soup to your guest. This is it. This is done. No more changes. And I thought that was a lovely way to explain it, because the younger our children are, the more they need the learning to cook steps. And the older they are, the more they want to prove they can do it. And they want to serve the soup. So think of it like that. And I think it takes it into the right sort of blend of thinking about things. So if we allow our children to keep tasting, keep adjusting, keep tasting, then when they're ready to serve the soup, they're going to be really happy with it. They're going to be glad to serve it, and they'll be proud of themselves for it. So that's the middle years. Once the adolescent, the 14 to 21, and I'm very consciously making these kind of larger spans of time. These are the years where the student grows into a sense of responsibility. They are actually seeking ways to be an individual who can have the responsibility for something and actually do it. Now, if the student has gone through the 7 to 14 successfully with a lot of soup tasting, then they're going to be ready to start serving up in their 14 to 21. If they have been hammered too hard in those middle years, then their executive function is going to be thwarted. And by the time they get to be teenagers, the resistance is established. Not because they are resistant, but because the behaviors have been established in such a way that it's really hard to get around them. So when that happens, then it's really important to realize that sometimes you have to kind of wind it back a little bit and work on one thing at a time. And I'll come back to that one thing at a time a little bit later. But it can be that some of the resistance that we see in our teenagers was gradually grown from the frustration of not having enough time to test the soup, that they were criticized for their soup on the first time through. And I think if as parents, if you think about, if you had to serve a meal to your children, and every time you were prevented from tasting and adjusting and fiddling a little bit before you served it, you would be frustrated because it may not turn out very well. And the family may not like it. But if you can adjust and, whenever you see a recipe that says salt to taste, that's because as human beings, we need that process. We need to be allowed to taste and adjust our experiences. So with that being said, the next thing that I want to show you is, as this child goes through developmental stages towards executive function, I just want to show you a couple of different ways that people speak about executive function, because this in itself can be extremely confusing. Why do you see something like this on a site, this beautiful site, understood.org? Oh my God, they have so many good things, so many good things. But they try to make an executive function a little bit more understandable by showing the three main areas that are affected by whether or not we have executive function. Working memory. Can you hold in your working memory just enough to deal with the demands of the moment? So working memory will extend from a few minutes to a few hours. Certainly will cover the working school day. But what if we what if our working memory isn't great? Are you going to remember from the beginning of class to the end of that same class period what's going on? You may not. And if you don't, then that's another indication that your executive functions aren't really strong in that area. What about being flexible in your thinking? Cognitive flexibility. Can you adapt and adjust when you're given new information? Maybe, maybe not. And what about, can you inhibit or control your responses? And so what we're going to find out a little bit later in the little list of executive functions that I have added for you based on my book, all of this is in there, but I've taken some of these out as executive functions and some of them out as a skill set we need to access our executive function. So we'll talk about that. But one of the things that this understood.org website will introduce is the idea of hot executive function. And these are the ones that we don't really, we need to be able to call on certain functions in the moment to get a job done. We can't leave them lying dormant. They have to kind of come to the front burner. They have to be hot. We have to be able to reflect. And that means review, reflect. And you'll find out that this is one of the most important things that we can help our students learn. And then there's processing speed. And oftentimes the trick with some of these is that you can learn to reflect, but your processing speed might be hardwired. And if it's hardwired, then how to change that is going to be slow, and it might be by way of something else. It's really hard to directly address processing speed. Okay, here's another way to look at it. This is where you are just simply being given a set of challenges that executive function can have. Now, I put this up here because I want you to be aware that I don't approach the concept of executive function based on challenge or difficulty. So I would never have put that word challenges in there, because what are the activities that every human being engages with more or less? They are everybody uses their memory more or less, strengths and weaknesses there. Everybody is driven by their personal sense of emotion. What makes one person experience emotion is very different from what another person experiences. What about how much effort we put into things? Some people can put a ton of effort into one area, others in another area, and they're both fine. They're just not the same. What about focus? That's going to have to do with your attention. So your focus can't really be judged from the outside, because who's to say your focus is fine and yours is not? Well, that's a little too undifferentiated for me. And then there's the activation. Can we get ourselves working? Can we activate ourselves to do whatever it is that we're being asked to do? You have to activate your thinking sometimes. You have to activate your feeling life or your sense of relevance, and you have to activate your actions. So there's no two people who are going to do this exactly the same. Now, here's my list, and this is based on the book, Helping Students Take Control of Everyday Executive Function. And as I was writing this book, it was already 10 years ago by now, but as I was writing it, I read everything that was available on executive functions that I could get my hands on. And I got very confused because everyone used different terms. Everyone used a different number of functions. Everyone used different definitions of those functions. So I finally ran an Excel spreadsheet where I put the author, the terms they used, how they were defining them, And I started to see that there were no two authors that agreed on terminology, amount, use, function, etc. So at that point, I made my own list. My list came from the students that I worked with. These were the kids that walked in the door. These were the students that would walk in the door and throw their backpack against the wall in utter frustration because they'd just come yet again from a school day that didn't work. They came yet again with a parent in tears because things were falling apart everywhere and nobody knew what to do to help. The teachers would be very specific about what the student had to do in order to be successful in that class. But that need and demand didn't translate into anything else. And so the parent is standing there saying, but if I put all my focus on getting that math homework done or the English paper written, then everything else falls apart. And this is why the parent is often the first person that I would look to see what does the parent need from this situation so that when I do something with the student, that it will make sense to everybody. So as you look at this list, there are going to be the elements of executive function that you'll find pretty much everywhere in some form. Attention. That is a function of that prefrontal cortex of our brain. Our memory, how we process memory for what we see, what we hear, what we read, what we write, what is the memory for events, the memory for skill, tons of different kinds of memory. What about organization, which has to do with space? Now, I separate out organization from time because I think they're two different activities completely. So how we organize our space and how we engage with time are two very separate activities. And when I'm working with a student, I actually separate out those two activities and give the student very different approaches to both. Then there's the inhibition and initiation. So often the student won't even know the meaning of these words. So what does it take for the student to get started on something? What does it take for the student to stop doing something? And sometimes it's easy to see if the student is engaged in something that they like, a computer game, a video game, as an example, they can get that started very fast. They will have a difficult time inhibiting that behavior. If they have to start something which they do not like, doing the dishes, their math homework, whatever it is, it will be very hard to find the go button. And it will be really easy to find the stop button. So here our stop and go buttons are pretty important and often have to do with what the comfort level of the student is. Then there's the flexibility issue. Can the student go from one activity to the other, one way of thinking to the other, one way of responding to the other? And flexibility is something that we don't often talk about, but it will impact how they can access and use their executive skills. The other stop and go button has to do with control of behavior and emotion. So we have stop and go buttons in our action, inhibition and initiation. We have stop and go buttons in our behavior and emotional controls. Are they easy for the student to access? Are they used at the right time? Maybe, maybe not. And then the goal setting. Many people will say the ultimate function of executive function is the ability to set a goal. And I'm going to get to that because that bothered me for a long time. Why? Why does everybody put so much emphasis on this goal setting stuff? And then I understood that it is inherent or in the background of everything we do. And I'll tell you why I say that. And just, I think it's another slide or two. All right. Now, what I did with the book is the first half of the book was the principles. or what I called in the book, ingredients. What ingredients do I need to put together a good attention cake? So I even use the idea of ingredients on the counter for, you have all these ingredients. What's your goal? It's to make dinner, to make a dessert, make cookies for a birthday party. What is your goal? And then you look at those ingredients, flour, water, milk, butter, whatever, salt, and you decide, in what measure am I going to use these ingredients to achieve that goal? Maybe I want to make a birthday cake. Then I'm going to use a lot more sugar and a lot less salt. If I want to make something as a savory main dish for dinner, I'm going to use the salt, but I may not use any sugar at all. I may not use flour. I may use a different grain or a different kind of pasta or a different something. This is where we have all of these different ingredients that we pick and choose from, depending on what executive function we are working on. So what are those ingredients? The first one is relationship. What I've discovered with the students coming in my office is that a lot of their response to life was based on what relationship qualities they had. And the relationship can be to a teacher, to a parent, to a coach, to a friend, or even the relationship to self, especially if the students were a little bit older and the teenagers who go through so many moments of self-doubt and self-recrimination. Those kind of relationships can be maybe temporarily, but they can be very painful for a student. Then there's this interesting thing, which became over the years my number one go-to starting point. And that is what I call review and preview and mental image. And I'm going to spend an entire slide on just that, because over the years, it has become clear to me that that will almost always be the right starting place for my work with students. How do they preview? How do they review? And what are the mental pictures that are being formed? That will lead you quicker and faster to the executive function the student needs than anything else I have found to date. Understanding naturally what a student's strengths and weaknesses are. Students often think one thing about their strengths and weaknesses, and everyone else who knows the student might think something completely different. And then there's this motivation and incentive thing. Now I'm going to speak about this for a minute because this is the next big stumbling block. Too many times, more times than I care to count, I've had parents come in, show me a school report, show me something from some other adult situation that says, if Johnny or Joey or Mary Sue were more motivated, then their grades would be higher, blah, 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 blah. And that is a major red flag for me. And I'm going to tell you why. Motivation is intrinsic. That means that you are motivated internally, personally, and individually. And I have yet to hear one person, I have yet to meet one individual who is not motivated. I have met a lot of people who do not understand what motivates somebody else. Tons of that. But the fact that I don't honestly believe that there is an unmotivated student out there, because I think you almost have to be asleep before you can say that. What we do have, though, is an entirely incentivized system. And so our students are in a system that has developed incentives at every level. do this and I will praise you, do that and I will criticize you. Praise, criticism. It's a huge polarity, good, bad, right, wrong, yes, no, grades, learn or I will show you how you're wrong. And I find that this is a really, really important point to understand as teachers and parents, how much our society, we depend on incentives. I mean, if I didn't have a stop sign at the end of my street, I would probably very quickly get into a serious accident at the end of my street. But if I appreciate the incentive, then I am going to stop at the stop sign. I'm going to be grateful that there are traffic laws. That incentivizes me to follow the rules. So incentives are not all bad. But the balance of how we use incentive and how we understand motivation, I think that is something that we can challenge ourselves with on a fairly, it would be fair to challenge ourselves about that. Synthesis and analysis, that might seem like a pretty big words, but all that really means is, does that student learn by understanding stuff from the whole to the parts, or do they understand better from the parts to the whole? So that I think is going to be a really important thing, because we have a yeah. Oh, sorry. I just have to do this 2 seconds. I'm sorry. One of the things that I have often had to really notice is whether or not a student does the student really understand things better if they have all the pieces of something and then gradually build a whole picture? Or is it better if you take the student to the overview and then develop all of the component parts? 2 seconds. I'm just going to stop the noise that's here. Hold on.
And while she's stepped away, I will go ahead and put the link to our additional sessions in the chat again, so that you're able to access our program and see what is coming in the next several months.
I'm so sorry about that. I'm with my friends and they are not used to having people online while they're talking right out the door. So they're happy to move off. But I wasn't sure if it was coming through, because sometimes that kind of stuff comes through the microphone too. And then the last one, of course, is the rhythm and routine. We've talked a little bit about rhythm and routine. The rhythm is the part of your life that comes around every year, like your birthday. Never the same birthday, but it always comes around on the same day. And routine, which is something that you do because it's routinized and you are trying to learn, say, muscle memory. You do things in sports that are both rhythm, let's run a couple of different plays, and routine, let's do that one exercise to get muscle memory. And then self-advocacy, we talked about that. So what I wanted to share with you here is a pretty interesting list of what are the tools that we need before we can even address our executive function. And that's one of the things that I would do as a coach, for example, to try to sort that through. That to me is understanding a little bit the difference between what might the student need in terms of the tools before they can actually address their executive functions directly. So one of the big questions a lot of people have is, where do I start? What do I start with? And what I've discovered is that one of this is just a little graphic of what are those tools that we have available, and why I so clearly have come to understand that this process of review and preview and mental image is so important. So let me start there, because sometimes if that's the only thing you end up doing, it ends up being a good something. So what is this? Now, in the world of executive function, you can get some pretty complex descriptions of what is this brain function. And I think it can be boiled down to something far more simple and straightforward. So what are we doing if we are activating our executive function? Now, if I say to you as parents right now, when we finish our conference this morning at noon, what will each one of you do? And I can guarantee every one of you had a quick mental image of what you're going to do. And many of you, without taking any time at all, could probably picture everything that's going to happen this afternoon. If I were to say to you, oh, we aren't going to stop at 12, we are going to stop at 1. And then a different set of pictures would happen. You would say, wait a minute, I had everything planned to work with 12. What do I need to change to make 1 work? What are you doing when you do that? If you understand that, you understand your executive function. So what are you doing? You are reviewing. Oh, wait a minute. I had my plan for 12 o'clock, but now, come back to the present, I have to look ahead and think, if I only get finished at 1, I have to change. Now I have to do goal-directed behavior, this, and this. That is your executive function, using review. What do I know about previous experiences? What's my previous knowledge? What's my previous understanding? Bring it into the present. What's the current situation? And now I have to look into the future and say, wait, with that information on board, what do I need to do to either change or establish my behavior for the future? Now, of course, it takes me, a minute or two to even say it. This happens in your brain at such a speed that you're talking nanoseconds, because that's how fast the executive function can work. Then if you say, wait a minute, I'm going to only get off at 1 o'clock. So the first thing I have to change is what was going to happen between 12 and 1. So you might go through a review and preview process about that and come up with a goal-directed new decision for what to do with that period of time. Then you might go through the whole process again. Well, if I have to adjust the 12 to 1, then what has to be, can I put it into the 1 to 2, or does that have to be adjusted also? Now, think about that process, and that is what you come to as an adult. You come to that kind of ability as an adult to quickly adjust, to be flexible, to be able to take the value of your previous experiences and apply it to a new set of decisions. This is what your executive function has brought you to, so that you can do that. And because this happens in every executive function activity, I started to understand this is the central thing. Now, what else do we bring to it? Well, your attention. How does your memory work? How flexible are you? That affects this. But this process is the core, it's the center. And as soon as I understood that, then I was able to actually teach students how to do this. So this is a skill that a student, depending on how young, but certainly the middle school students can learn how to do this. The high school students can learn how to do this. And what they can learn how to do is actually activate all of that, which is their reflective review. And if they're not afraid to review, then this is a really good skill to learn. And what do I know about the situation? So say they do this every minute of every day. They walk into a classroom, and if they are not assigned seats, how are they choosing the seat that they're going to sit on? How do they choose it? What they reflect on previous experience. Oh, last time I sat near the window, it was too distracting, so I'm going to try by the wall today. Or I want to sit by that person, or I want to be up front, I want to be in the back. All of that belongs to their review and reflecting on previous knowledge. Today, I have to still walk into the room and sit down. So now I'm going to take that review and have it inform my behavior. It's going to tell me where I want to go. So if you do that in something as simple as walking into a room and taking a seat, now apply that to, you have homework. How are you going to do your homework? And the very first thing I teach students is how to put together a homework board, or in the situation if they don't have homework. Some school districts have done away with homework, but what do you have to do at any given moment, whether it's homework or other things? So say it's homework, I have the student get a whiteboard, and then I have them think back, what are the pieces, the big pieces of homework that they have? And put a big E if they have English homework, M if they have math homework. You get the idea. They don't have to write out the whole word. Then they need to be able to put a code for what's your English homework? R chap 2. They have to read something or they have to write something. Their math homework, P75, page 75 odd, whatever. I'm just making stuff up now. And so then, before they finish, they have to look at that homework and put an estimated amount of time that that's going to take. So about how much time does your English take you? Well, I'm going to need 45 minutes for that. I don't read fast. Good. How much time will that math take you? Oh, that will only take me 20 minutes because I already know it and I'm mostly finished. Okay, anything else? Which of these pieces on the homework board are you going to do first? Now let's prioritize. Put it in time order. I'm going to do the math first because I think that will be quick. I'm going to do the English second in case I go over time. Perfect. That's your homework board. And again, it took me longer to say it than it will to do it. To do it should take roughly, at most a minute. But the idea there is you have reviewed and previewed for every topic that you need to do something about, or every piece of work if it's not a homework board and it's a chore board or whatever. And that will help you organize your thoughts on the what, prioritize your thoughts on the when, and possibly even start forming pictures in your head for the how. But you do all of that using this principle of review and preview based on mental images. It's like magic. And then it can be adapted very differently for very, very different people. Now, you can see from this next slide why I had to make it more simple. Because, for example, Russell Barkley is one of the preeminent people speaking on executive function and ADHD. But if I were to say to you as parents, please, how would you describe nonverbal spatial temporal working memory? And you would say, what? And I would say, nonverbal spatial temporal working memory. And you would still say, what? But if I say to you, forming a mental picture and practicing review and preview, what are your decision-making results that come out of that process? It makes a whole lot easier to understand. And this is, I think, why it's important to know that there's some pretty academic stuff out there, but you don't really have to understand it through that lens if you would prefer not to go there. But in order for executive functions to be meaningful, we have to really be able to say, why is it important? Why does it matter that our students learn executive function? And then we understand if we can just keep it simple and say, because we have to be able to control our attention and our behaviors, then suddenly, oh yeah, I get it now. It's easier to understand why it's important. And then how can we make this work? So using this review and preview, forming a mental picture as one of the most important tools in your toolbox. And there are others. But I think by the end of the morning, one thing you may have discovered is that I don't talk about make a list or checkboxes or some of the more standard quick answers people give for what to do with a student who has executive dysfunction. Because what I've discovered is that if the student comes to that, that's when it will work. If the student is told to do that, that's when it will not work. So let's take a quick look in our last 15 minutes or so before we open it up for questions. Let's take a quick look at two areas that I think affect everybody profoundly. And these two areas, we could do an entire week on these kind of things. And sometimes I do entire 8-hour presentations on this. So what I'm trying to do today is just give you a taste of it, a little bit of an overview of it. But it's important for what this is an idea that I think, I don't know anyone else who talks about attention like this, but in my experience with my students, what I've noticed is that there are two main types of attention. And the one kind is active attention. What do I actively pay attention to? And right now, the person who is translating, thank you very much, is actively paying attention to the words. And every word is being carefully heard. Some of the rest of you might actually be actively paying attention to the words, but passively you're monitoring your home life. Like for me, a few moments ago, I was actively engaged in thinking about what I was saying and and then I was passively extremely bothered by this loud voice, being afraid that you might be hearing it too. So in that moment, my passive attention was taken to that, and I had to deal with it. Now, think about your students. All day long, they're in school for what, 7 hours every day? And of those 7 hours, a good 5 hours are direct instruction time. And they are being asked to give active attention without pause for 7 hours or 5 hours or however long it is to the active instruction being given. But that's inhuman that you cannot do that. So their passive attention what they think about in between, what they look at out the window, what they, taking a drink of water, resetting your active attention right there. But what I think it's important to realize that we spend more time in our passive attention. More of our attention is in the passive range than the active range. So the active is extremely functional and specific, and it's effective, but we don't spend as much time there as we do in our passive attention. Right now, if you just take 1 second and notice, what do you notice around you? Do you notice sound, color, temperature, movement, noise? Do you notice your own thoughts taking you someplace else? That's really how attention works. If we are to try to be too active in our attention, too one-sided, then we'll be exhausted. And I think it's lovely that we have this translator today, but I will guarantee you a language translator, sign language person is going to be extremely tired at the end of 2 hours, because it's that much active attention with no pause. You can't afford passive attention during those times, because otherwise you miss things and then you can't do it. It's astonishing, how much of our time is spent in passive attention. And it also makes us understand our students better, because there's nothing that's not wrong that they have passive attention. And what you'll notice is that as we get talking about attention a little bit more with this slide, which I can't go into in too much detail because it's too detailed, but I wanted to show you a person with attention, which is every human being, is going to have these main areas of experience. A person with ADHD is going to have an imbalance in one of these areas. One area is going to be overwhelming or way too underwhelming to be helpful. So as we understand attention, we all have controls on our attention that control our mental energy, alertness, sleeping, waking, how much effort it takes us to stay awake, and how much consistency we have in that. Every human being has controls that process our attention. So this is a word that I actually will share with my students called saliency determination. And they say, what? So salient means important. So how do you use your attention to determine what is important? In everything that I've said this morning, every one of you have had to determine for yourself what is important. So some of you heard certain things, others heard other things. And I can guarantee at the end of this time we have together, everyone will have heard something different. That's saliency determination. And that is individual. How much we process the detail, how much we are cognitively activated so that we can process, how much time we spend with attention awake, like attention span, and how much do we need our satisfaction? Do we need to have satisfaction in what we pay attention to? So some people need that more, and some people can listen to stuff that isn't terribly exciting or satisfying, but they have a reason that they spend time listening to it, and then they can decide what to do with it later. That takes a mature person. The third area is, how do we produce out of our attention? What do we do with it? And one of those areas is review and preview. And how do we use our attention to initiate or inhibit? So one of the places you see this is with the student who is very prone to blurting out and just uninhibitedly just jumping up and doing something. So that's where the production control is maybe not on. So how much does the student self-reflect? So I work with this kind of breakout with adults and children. Now, children are going to have lower controls because they're more immature in their development of executive function. Adults will discover that they have very individualized strengths and weaknesses in these controls. And it's a fascinating process to go through. Again, we don't have time to dive into it today, but it's worth a good look at some point. So these slides are just a little bit more explanation about those slides, just bigger, easier to see. But now let's take a look at this. This is the thing that I'm going to probably end with, but I really want you to understand that our relationship with time is directly linked to our executive function. And what I mean by that is, if you look at this clock, which is the astronomical clock on the church face in Prague in Czechoslovakia, you won't know how to tell what is it telling you. You don't know, because that clock doesn't give you a mental image of time. Now, if you learned how to read it, it would tell you the year, the month, the week, and the day. But I haven't learned how to read it. But what I do know is that every person that I've worked with pictures time differently. Let me just give you an example. Picture for yourself the course of a year. Where does your year start? Now, take your hand in the air and show, I mean, I can't see your cameras are off, but how does your year progress? Do you go from left to right, from up to down, around in a circle, in a wave? What happens in your mental picturing of the process of a year? Mine happens to be vertical. I go from top to bottom. I don't know why, but I do. Now, how do you picture the flow of a month, the days of the month going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right now we're on the 18th, and that's going to be where in your picture. And a lot of people just picture a calendar month face. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? That's fairly typical. What about a week? People picture the week very differently. Does your week start on Sunday in your mind? Or does it start on Monday? Is Monday through Friday a certain kind of movement and Saturday, Sunday different or not? How about the day, the hours of the day? How do they go for you? And one of the things that you can discover is the value of mental image as it reflects in how we picture time. And when a student gets introduced to that idea, suddenly it's easier to understand where the confusion has come from, because we are asking students to, if we say today is March 18th and your project is due on April 7th, we are asking that student to picture how months go, how the whole year, and because we're in March of the year, how the week goes, and how the hours go. And students often hear the words and make no picture. So when we try to help a student prepare for a deadline that's 10 days out, we actually need to teach them how to break down those time frames to be able to understand it. And sometimes that needs to be broken down in a visual, sometimes it can be broken down in different ways. But if we don't understand how the student sees time, we won't know how to help. We might break it down in the way that we see it, and the students is no better off than they were when they couldn't see anything at all. So if we understand that, then we understand a lot about what our students need and how to make it work for them. But picturing time is another key and was to me surprising area of access to help the students with fundamental executive function without just resorting to a list or a calendar face. Now, let's just run over these basic principles and then I'll open it up for questions. If we're talking about executive functions, there are some really important golden rules to understand. It's a huge area. Can't do it all at once. The arc is long. But if we use review and preview, we will get where we want to go much easier. And all of that is based on mental images, which supports every level and every aspect of executive function skills. Understand and trust that attention controls are there to help us understand active and passive attention, not to change it. We use our memory as how you get a memory in is going to be the same way you get it back out again. So whatever memory tricks you use to get the information in that you might need for a test or something you're doing at work, that's how you're going to retrieve those memories as well. Time it's your picture that will guide you so much more accurately towards how do you want to set up your time pictures. And then you can work to your picture and you'll be much more successful doing it that way. And organization is, yes, it is a very outer thing, but remembering that it's based on a kind of inner organization that's based on your relationship to your environment. So as we approach not only our children, but ourselves, change is going to happen slowly on this arc. Remember, this part of the brain matures very slowly. So you might have to practice a lot before you start to realize it's become automatic. If you work on that inside stuff before you put a whole lot of outer tricks in place, you'll get there faster. And remember, this is actually a process that could be pretty exciting. I kind of say enjoy the ride, but remember that as parents, you are, I'm going to stop the share. You are, as parents, sort of bridging several worlds with your child. So this is going to give you the most exciting access to your own executive function that you could possibly ever imagine. So with that, I want to give enough time to answer any of the questions. It looks like some of them are individual questions about the getting the materials to you, which Marcy can answer.
Yep, we've had a couple of questions in the chat. We will be posting this to our YouTube channel, and I placed that link earlier in the chat so that folks could access. It takes about a week to edit and post, so be looking for it probably the beginning of the week after this one that's coming. And then we will also follow up with an email with the slides in both English and Spanish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so one of the things that I wanted to say is I'm happy to take questions, and sometimes there are a lot of questions and sometimes there are not, and either way is really okay. But if you ask questions, then try to just put it in terms of generics so that we don't have to stop the recording. Because if you ask specific student questions, we'll have to stop the recording because that we can't do. But I'll do my best to, and if you have a question, kind of give me a range of age that we're talking about, so that the same question would be answered differently if the student was 6 or if they were 26. Okay, yeah, that's a good question. Timothy, it looks like. What would be the best next steps to continue learning about how to coach students in executive functioning? Timothy, there are a couple of things. You could go a little bit into detail if you wanted to with some of these areas of executive function and areas of ingredients. And I put some more detail in the book, but another place that I would highly recommend that you look at is Sarah Ward, Sarah, I think, Ward, Ward. And she has a really good website, and she gives really good presentations on executive function with some of the more practical kind of things that you can do. But she breaks it down in a very understandable way, focused a lot on how teachers can work with the middle school and high school students. She has excellent ideas for how to, say, set up a calendar. Like one of the ideas that I got from her that I really liked was, if you have a long project and you have to teach a student how to deal with a long project over time, she would take sticky notes and put each step of the process on the sticky note, and then put it on the date that part of the process was due. And as she got to the sticky note, if it wasn't done, she had to pick up the sticky note and put it on the next day, so that you could actually visually see yourself accomplishing stuff. Simple things like that she does. And I think as a middle school or high school teacher, you might pick up a couple of things that would be very helpful. Most important, as a teacher, I would urge you to practice review and preview at the beginning of every lesson. It takes about 30 seconds. Last time we covered XYZ. Today, we will cover ABC. And at the end of the lesson, so we got through A and B. So tomorrow we'll start with C and go to D and E. It takes you about 30 seconds to review and preview at the beginning and end of every lesson you teach. And I can guarantee you that your students will thrive if you do that, because that's what they can't do yet, and you're modeling it for them. Let me just see. Changing to understand, accept ADHD and the role of executive function. Yeah, ADHD is huge, because ADHD, there's one other thing I would really advise you to get a hold of. If your concerns are with ADHD, and Marcy, I can send this to you, that you can send it around with the other materials. It's an article that is titled "The 3 Most Unrecognized Characteristics of ADHD." It's very good. And I will send that to you, because anybody dealing with ADHD would actually benefit you to dig into those 3 areas. And it's from the Attitude magazine, so it's easily available online too, but I'll send you a copy just so that you can get it out and about. So when you have students who are engaged in a lot of sensory activity, somebody is talking about a 6-year-old engaged in a lot of sensory activity, look at that not as a behavior. Try to read the behavior instead of as a behavior that has to be stopped. What information is that young child getting from the world through touch? And can that be redirected and still be good touch? Touch is a good thing, but sometimes it has to be redirected. So again, whenever you see these kind of things and you recognize change needs to happen, think in terms of reframing and refocusing rather than eradicating. You don't want to necessarily stop your child from working through the sensory modality, but you want to create a sensory modality that is positive. I would like to just say one thing about senses, and because this could be an entire day, but the person with ADHD often uses touch as a way of keeping the neurology connected so that their attention can stay in the on position. Because the minute the senses aren't engaged in something like touch, they're offline. And so they touch again. And if the situation is such that the person touches, something that is identified as what the touch can be, then it's easier to understand that that's usually the source of it. Understand the source of some of this stuff, and it makes it so much easier to redirect and redefine.
I want to make sure we had a question up above that I think we might have missed. Ms. Wilson said, can you share some goals for an IEP to mitigate an executive functioning deficit for a 9-year-old?
9-year-olds are, okay, so depending a little bit on what the IEP is for, whether it's for a language processing issue or whether it's for a math difficulty or whatever, remember that what you're teaching at 9 is how to review and preview. So 9-year-olds should be given examples of what they're being asked to do. 9-year-olds should be given ample versions of review and preview. For example, a teacher guide for what they're working on. Guided notes are often important because at 9, they may not have a very highly developed processing of their memory. They might need some visuals to support some of the more complex concepts that they're working on. And 9-year-olds, you must identify language-based challenges, because if you don't accurately identify the academic need, then you can do anything from now until the cows come home and it won't do any good. So identify and highlight the actual need, and then you'll be able to be much more clear in writing a single goal or two that will actually meet the need. But I have never met a student who's been identified as having executive function needs that has only one thing going on. So I would say, especially for the IEP, be really careful that you have honestly identified the processors at play, language processing being one of them. Okay.
And I think the other question I saw in there is, does inclusion or more socialization allow a child to make more strides in accomplishing things? Her son is 10 and seems to be no longer to want to be a loner, but is included in activities and now has a friend group, and she's seeing a bit more confidence.
So that's a very, very broad question, and I applaud the parent for trying to make it a bigger question and not about the student. But inclusion and socialization are also areas that could use some defining. So if a student is in a social situation, what are they able to learn, and under what circumstances are they able to learn that? So if the student is in a social situation, are they learning more because there is more co-regulation and project-based stuff? Or are they learning more because in that social situation, the individual voice of the teacher is heard better because the social need is stilled? What about inclusion? Does that mean that there are a whole lot of variety of needs in the room? Are they all being met evenly? So I think when you see good results from group activities, then that means that there are some things the child is picking up on that they are learning to do because the support of the other group. It can even be that the social situation provides the student with enough body doubles that the other students doing the same thing provides motivation and or guidance and or imitation material for them, which might be in itself the value. So I think imitation and inclusion and socialization can be really valuable, but all by themselves, they won't be the only thing that's going to be helpful. Yeah. Okay.
We had a couple more, a generic for a preteen with autism. How does the parent help him to be more attentive and also remember to do his homework more often?
Autism changes the rules. So the way that I've talked about executive function is a little different than how you talk about executive function for autism. And the autism issue about independence at that age, and what was the other part of that question? Attention was the other part of that question?
Be more attentive and remember to do his homework.
Okay, so remember that attention is processed differently by the person with autism. One of the things to remember is that when autism is on board, the individual will very often be able to process sensory inputs one or two at a time. In other words, they can coordinate those two inputs. What they can't do is integrate them. And so as you set the student up for the activity that they're trying to do, make sure that when the instructions are given, that those sensory requirements are one or two. You can listen to me and I can show it to you, but then I'm not going to touch you or ask you to do anything just yet. And when the person has to do work, try to keep it very specific to a channel, a sensory channel, because it's the overload of channels and processors that can often be the trigger for the meltdown or the block to getting something done. So at that age, at 15, first of all, understand what every 12 or 15-year-old is going to be like, and then turn the dial for those special sensitivities that autism brings with it. And it might make it easier for one. So homework boards I have worked with people with autism, and they work well because it makes it a visual that's not overwhelming. And once they learn how to do it, they can do it without any input from you. And then they can keep to their homework board, which they have determined to be as busy or as quiet as they can handle. So figuring out how to shift the power focus with autism to acknowledge the limits and the needs of sensory processing can be extremely helpful.
Okay, we have one more that I see. It says, can you share some advice for IEP goals for a student who is 6 years old who needs to be redirected?
Okay, 6 years old, they should be in the sandbox. IEP goals for a 6-year-old are what we have to do because that's the system we have. But think in terms of 6 years old and attention. And that's any student that needs redirection means that they are being asked to engage in active attention at a level that they are not yet mature enough to do. So build into your IEP not only enough breaks, sensory breaks, because that isn't always what the student needs, but very gently introduce what I call attention decisions. Ask the student to pay attention and tell them in advance, I'm going to say 3 sentences. And at that 3 sentences, you don't have to, you can take a break. Here are the 3 sentences. Today's homework is blah, 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 da, 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 da. The problem with a 6-year-old, very underdeveloped brain and our usual way of interacting is that we as adults get started and we never stop. And so a student never knows when can they turn off. So they have to turn off whenever they can. The way that I work with attention decisions with my especially older students is that you can turn on your active attention and pay attention actively, sometimes for a minute, sometimes 2, and then your attention decision dies. And when it dies, it's not coming back to life. It's done. So what you need to do is take a 5-second brain reset. What can be a brain reset? Watch this. Just reset my brain. What about this? Reset. Reset. Stand up, sit down, reset. Resets can be really short, but they have to be allowed, because if they're not allowed, then what we're really doing is asking the student to be on active attention without stop. And I promise you, as teachers, you can't do it. The reason you can't do it is because you always get to stand in the classroom. If you want to, you can stand up all day long. And you can sort of move, and you can be a little bit in and out of up here, down there, look around, look out, look in. You're in a constant state of brain reset because you can move around. And our students are being asked to sit still and listen and do exactly what we tell them to. So in the IEP, instead of saying, I don't know how you could write this, but awareness that short attention demands are going to be more effective than having a person stay with it too long. Give the student, write 1 sentence and then stand up, sit down. And as soon as I see you stand up, sit down, I'll know that you finished your sentence. Then move on to the next one. And at the end of your next math problem, you can stand up and twirl around and sit back down again. Give a student these kinds of things, and you'll find that they're learning over time self-regulation. But 6 years old on an IEP is really it's a control document at that point. The arc of time that the 6-year-old is going to need to come to compliance of behaviors is too long for the school year. So keep those IEP goals really, really simple, tone them down, and give the student lots and lots and lots of breathing and movement through the day. And if possible, little tiny breaks to play. Maybe you have the student, well, there are lots of things. I'm not sure of all the situation, but you get the idea. Bring a kind of slight turn in the thinking around that student, and you might get better results. Okay.
All right, I think that's it from the chat. Does anyone else have any other questions? I think one last question that came in is, what are the benefits of homework modification for students who have executive functioning challenges?
The benefits are endless. Homework should be modified to be a very, very short period of time at night because students need to recover. And I'm a very strong personal proponent of moderate homework. 15 to 20 minutes. And remember that those students who are having executive function difficulty, they need their family more than ever. The family that is burdened by homework isn't available to the student. So from a social, emotional perspective, homework must be limited for these students because they are not gaining any value out of the homework nightmare. I don't know any students that are really gaining value added from homework struggles. So keep it really small if possible. Point systems, be careful with them because they are based on incentives. Do this and I will praise you. Do that and I will harm you. It is possible to have some point systems that are effective. What I've discovered over time is that at times point systems work in families and then they don't work. And then you need to come up with something else. So rather than say, don't use them, I would say, understand what they are. A point system is an incentive system. If you feel that is both how you can work and how your student can work, implement gently, but remember that there may come a time when the point system doesn't work at all. And then what would be another option for you? So rather than say, no, don't do it, just again, know what it is that you're doing. If an incentive system is something that fits both who you are as a personality and who your student is, then you will find a way to make it right. But don't do it if you don't understand that that's what you're doing.
All right. Well, we want to thank you so
Yeah.
much, Paula, for being with us.
My
And
pleasure.
I've just seen in the chat. Oh, we have one more question come through. You mentioned internal motivation, but not external. Can external scaffold the internal?
It's a real tricky thing to create external motivation that doesn't get incentivized. So think about that. And then you can, it will scaffold. Yes, motivation. But if you identify what it is that motivates the student, is it praise or power or, rewards, or what is it that motivates? And then that will also help you understand how to work with that. But don't scaffold anything externally that isn't also going to find its reflection internally in the nature of that child. So find out first, what does that student respond to? And then you can kind of enhance it. And in that way, I think you're probably talking about external scaffolding by enhancing what is in their nature. You can't change their nature, but you can enhance it. Yeah.
Great. Thank
Okay.
you.
Well, it was nice to meet all of you.
It was lovely to meet you. I do want to take a minute and say that we have a busy week coming up as far as our empowerment conference. I'm going to put the link in the chat one more time for our additional sessions. And I will tell you that Tuesday is a very busy day. If your student is a participant in iReady, then at 10 a.m. on Tuesday, we have a family session from our iReady vendor, and looking at what the strategies are with iReady and some of the individual reports that are available. And then Tuesday night, we have a dual session going on. We have our Special Education Citizens Advisory Committee, who has Ms. Joan Green coming in to talk about technology supports for students. That is at 6:30 at the same time, and both of these are being recorded if you choose to only attend one. We have our wellness team coming in for some wellness and self-care for parents, and both of those will also be posted on our YouTube channel. And I want to make sure, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge, we also have Karen Andrews here, who is our coordinating supervisor for the Department of Special Education, and Miss Pamela Boozer-Struther, who is a parent, but is also a member of our County Board of Education. All right, so everyone should expect an email from me in order to give you, there'll be a survey for the session, there'll be a link to the recording, and there will be the slides in English and Spanish as well. And we want to thank you for taking time out of your busy Saturday to join us this morning. And we hope to see you across the next couple of months.